So are we ready to go, Vanessa? Hello, everybody. My name's Helen Clue. Welcome to this special WCRP session. It feels weird that I'm talking to myself and I can't see you, but I'm sure that there's a group of you out there joined us today for this session. So I'm now going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully that will, get us into, and is that okay with everybody just before I get going?
Just click on swap presenter view and slideshow at the top. Yep, you're good to go now, Helen. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. So I'm going to come straight down to the opening part of the session. So I'll come to the program in a minute, but first of all, as I said, welcome everyone here today. This is a special session run by WCRP, and as such, the chair of the Joint Scientific Committee for the WCRP, who's Professor Detlef Stammer, has sent us a message that I'm going to read out, and then I will join in the welcome. So Detlef wasn't able to be here at this time. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, I think, in Germany where he is, but he did want to me to read a message of welcome to you, which goes as follows. So on behalf of the wider community, I welcome you all to the Climate Research Forum for Oceania. I would have very much liked to welcome you in person, but the timing of the event has made it difficult for me to do so. However, I know that Helen Clue will be present and will address you, and that gives me confidence that the WCRP is going to be fully and excellently presented. As Helen will explain, the WCRP has initiated these regional consultation events to inform the wider community about the developments that are going on within the WCRP, and also to hear from you about the aspects that maybe aren't well enough represented in our planning and in our thinking. Very importantly, WCRP also wants to engage with those communities who so far may not have been familiar with our work and our mission. That includes the next generation of scientists who soon will be carrying out the climate research going forward into a time when climate change will come to be an even bigger problem for society than it has been before. Our initial experience and feedback has shown a huge enthusiasm for these regional consultations, and at the same time have demonstrated the need for them. This means that we're actually planning regional consultation events for around the world, with events in various stages of planning in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, Oceania. So this forum today, the Oceania Sub-Region Forum, is the furthest along in its planning, and I'm very happy to see the seminar happening to address climate research priorities within the WCRP and beyond. I wish you all the best, and I'm eager to hear about the results. So that's from Detlef, and I'll just echo Detlef's comments and welcome you all here today, and thank you for taking the time to join us. I especially want to thank AMOS for allowing us to hold this session during their conference, and for their patience and help as we figured out how to actually run the session today. Similarly, I want to thank the local organising committee for WCRP. That's Lisa Alexander, Julie Arblaster, Ben Galton-Fenzi, and Lauren Vargo. Lauren's joining us from New Zealand, I hope, technology permitting, and I know she's been on field work as well, so I hope she's made it. And I would like to extend this welcome to our Kiwi friends and colleagues who have joined us this afternoon. As you'll hear later on, we're actually planning additional forums such as this one, with a focus on New Zealand and other parts of Oceania as well. They're still in the planning phase. So just in this introductory session, I just want to briefly touch on the purpose of these forums. Detlef's introduction touched on it. They were an initiative that resulted from a discussion that the WCRP were having last year in the context of our new strategic plan and how we were going to go about implementing it. We got feedback from our community that many people weren't particularly aware not only of our new strategy in the WCRP, but more broadly what the WCRP were about. So we resolved to run a series of what we called then these regional consultations. Clearly they had to be virtual, but we made virtue out of that necessity because it means we can hold them at time zones that work for the people in the region. It means we can target them, these sessions, these discussions, to meet the needs of individual nations or regions. We called them climate research forums to highlight their main purpose, which is for them to be a forum for engagement and discussion, even though it's fair to say this first one's perhaps a little bit more of us talking to you, and with a clear focus on science and on research, to talk about the role that the WCRP can play in shaping and strengthening the climate science that is done around the world to ensure it's relevant and meeting the growing demand for climate knowledge, information and services. To put it more succinctly, we want these to be a forum that enables information sharing, dialogue, engagement with our broader community so that we can build diversity. We think these are all important aspects of enhancing the quality and relevance of our science, as well as strengthening our community and leadership. In terms of how you can engage today and beyond, we'll talk about that more in session 4. For our AMOS participants, you're now very familiar, I think, with the live Q&A and discussion forum buttons that you'll see on the portal. The live Q&A is if you wish to ask a question, we have moderators who will read those questions out. The discussion forum is where you can have a discussion. And we will be recording this session as well so that we've got all of the discussion and information. And the organisers have been very generous, having a lively discussion and wish to continue that into the afternoon tea break, then this forum will be held open to enable us to do that. And I just want to remind us all that, that this session is actually being recorded. So I'm going to move straight to the first part. So here's the program. I've just put this up again. We've already had the introduction. What we're going to do now is I'm going to give a short presentation on the WCRP, and then we'll go to 3 talks from our colleagues, and that will be followed by a moderated or facilitated Q&A, and then I'll come back in the end. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to keep moving through because we've got a fairly tight schedule today. So this first talk from me is to briefly describe the WCRP, the World Climate Research Program, and our strategic plan, and importantly, some of the new initiatives that are underway as part of our implementation of that plan. It's important that we bring our climate research community along with us as we develop this new WCRP. It's equally important that our partners and our sponsors and our stakeholders are also involved, and that we engage with our national funding agencies and our users of climate knowledge and information, both at a national level but also globally. And so that's part of the purpose of these forums. This is a very high level presentation, so it's not going into huge detail. And I hope that it will be the first step for what will be a broader discussion, not just today, but after today. But I do hope that it does encourage some questions and discussion. So who or what is the WCRP? It's a world program which addresses frontier scientific questions relating to the coupled climate system. These are questions that are too large and too complex to be tackled by any individual nation or research agency or institution, or even any single scientific discipline. So it requires a world climate research program, and therefore coordination and collaboration around the world and across disciplines. And this is really the unique value proposition for the WCRP. It takes a global program coordinated to research the climate system, the oceans and the atmosphere, the land and the cryosphere, their interactions and feedbacks with human systems as well as natural ecosystems. Of course, it involves observations, analyses and modelling. The WCRP also needs to bring together scientists from around the world across all stages of their career to pursue our goal of advancing the understanding of the multi-scale and dynamic interactions between all these components of the climate system, as well as the external forcing and the role that humans play. The WCRP has been around for over 40 years. It was established in 1980 to provide the leadership and the organisational structure to facilitate this coordination. Our focus, especially in the first 4 decades, was very much on understanding the climate system, including the predictability of that system and how human activities are affecting the climate through changes to the climate system. Looking forward into the future, we recognise the emerging and actually quite urgent needs by society for climate information that can be used in decision making, managing climate risks, realising opportunities, and supporting climate adaptation planning, as well as informing and evaluating climate mitigation policies. Meeting that challenge will require new science, new technologies, new ways of co-designing knowledge and information so that it is relevant for those that are using this information. As I've been saying, this requires a coordinated effort worldwide, as well as a well-prepared workforce of scientists and researchers and technologists. It also needs to be supported by strong global partnerships. So our strategic plan essentially addresses these challenges and opportunities for the coming decade. It's a strategic plan which means it articulates what our vision is, and it's written there, a world that uses sound, relevant and timely climate science to ensure a more resilient present and sustainable future for humankind. And a strategic plan is about how are we going to achieve that vision and being very clear about what our mission is or what our purpose is. And it's important that we're clear here, we are not a funding agency. We don't bring large amounts of research funding. Our purpose is around coordination and facilitation of the climate research that's being done around the world so that we can further develop, share and apply the climate knowledge so that it contributes to societal well-being. If you want to know more about the strategic plan, there's a photo of it. You can go to our website and there's a short movie there that you can watch as well that provides some background information and history about the WCRP. So the strategic plan on a page, if you like, is this diagram here. It's based around the 4 scientific objectives that you can see on the right-hand side, advancing our fundamental understanding of the climate system, processes, the variations and the changes, predicting the near-term evolution of the climate system, refining our ability to anticipate and quantify future trajectories of the climate system, including climate change, and better integrating natural and social sciences so that we're building a bridge between climate science and society. Of course, this is across a range of interacting space and timescales, hence the arrow on the right-hand side. To achieve those objectives, at the very core of the WCRP are those 4 words: understanding, observing, modelling and collaboration. It also depends critically on our infrastructure, not just for observations and not just for modelling, but also for data storage, data sharing and data curation, to support communication and outreach, because it's important for the WCRP to connect with our broader science community and our stakeholders. And that means that not only do we need the infrastructure to support that, but it means that partnerships, capacity building, engagement, communication are all important as well. And you can see them on the next layer out on the circle. This is especially so because the WCRP science that we're coordinating informs the development of policies and agreements like the Paris Agreement, and it also informs operationally focused climate services. Plus, it supports science capacity building and education, often through partnerships with other programs and with national programs and agencies as well. So the strategic plan is a high-level statement of the science, infrastructure and collaborations that we need to ensure that our climate science is going to meet the challenges ahead and the demand by society for climate information and climate knowledge. Since 2019, our task has been to develop a plan for implementing this strategy. That includes identifying and prioritising those research activities that are critically important over the coming decades. One of the ways that we've done this is to develop a series of new, what we're calling lighthouse activities. And these are designed or being designed to foster new science and technologies. Some of them also consider what new and appropriate institutional frameworks and mechanisms might be needed. These lighthouse activities could be major experiments, high-profile projects, or infrastructure building blocks. The most important thing is that they're intended to be ambitious, exciting, very much externally and impact-focused and forward-looking. They are a new and critical part of our strategy for delivering the robust and actionable climate information that's needed. For example, to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals or disaster risk reduction plans for vulnerable regions and communities. In keeping with the theme of the AMOS conference, they are all about science for impact. They'll draw on the broader WCRP fundamental science, infrastructure and partnerships, and indeed capabilities from all across the WCRP to meet the goals and objectives of these lighthouses. So you can see the 5 names on this slide. The next slide I'm going to now go to, which provides a little bit more detail on these new lighthouse activities. Actually, if you go to our website, you'll find a short sort of 2-pager flyer that describes these a little bit more. It's very important that I'm clear that these are actively under construction. So the purpose of this slide is to give a headline, but they are being still developed and they may still evolve and develop from what you see written on this slide. So briefly, to start at the top, the Explaining and Predicting Earth System Change Lighthouse is all about the building an integrated capability for observing and explaining near-term Earth system change to provide both early warning and predictions. So it's got to focus on those nearer-term timescales, the multi-annual to decadal timescales. My Climate Risk is about developing a new framework, the kind of appropriate framework that we need to assess and explain regional climate risk so that the information that's being delivered is meaningful at local scales where planning happens. The Safe Landing Climates Lighthouse is actually taking a multi-decadal to centennial timescale perspective to explore the routes to climate-safe landing spaces for human and natural systems. For example, it might look at what those future pathways look like to achieve key sustainable development goals. Digital Earths is perhaps more cross-cutting and more technical in nature. It's about developing a digital and dynamic representation of the Earth system, combining observations and models to enable us to explore the past, the present and possible futures of the Earth system. And the Climate Academy, or WCRP Academy, is really picking up on this role around capacity building and education. And so it's about determining what the needs are and what mechanisms we can build to enable that education to happen. It will work with many other WCRP activities, including the lighthouses, and also other providers of climate education. So where are we at in terms of these lighthouses? Because they've got the community really excited. So right now, we have science plan development teams for each of the lighthouses drafting a plan, whether that's a science plan or in case of the Academy, a business plan. And they'll be doing that over the next 6 months or so. We've got representation from across the community in developing those plans. We'll be doing a lot of consultation through 2021, and that's important because in addition to developing the plans, we are committed to enhancing the diversity of the science community that we're in training into that plan development and also those that are using it. We want to co-design some of these activities with our key partners, and we need to ensure that these plans are not something that sit on a shelf. These lighthouses need to be dynamic and responsive, or the activities, I should say, need to be dynamic and responsive to the changing needs that happen over the coming years. And they also need to integrate and draw upon all of that broader WCRP research. We're also looking to funding partners seeking interest from potential funding partners. And in session 4, we'll talk more about how you can connect if you're interested in these lighthouse activities. The second, so that was one of the ways we're addressing our research priorities. The second, though, is that we will continue to prioritise the science and the technologies that will advance our understanding of the multi-scale dynamics of the Earth's climate system and to co-produce the climate information that's needed to meet these societal needs. To do that requires a whole range of skills and capabilities, and some of them are listed on the slide in front of you. And these have been fostered and developed by the WCRP and our communities over many, many decades. They are the very foundation of the climate system science that the WCRP are coordinating. Organisationally in the WCRP, they've existed as quite a large array of core projects, working groups, panels and advisory councils. Sustaining and nurturing these capabilities and the research communities that sit behind them into the future so that they endure is very important for the WCRP. You can see the title at the top. We think of these activities as also being not just research activities, but homes of our expertise. To ensure that we're doing this, we've had to refine our organisational structure and elements somewhat so that we're prioritising and strengthening these core capabilities and the research activities so that they are fit for purpose for the climate knowledge and information needs into the future. So that's all very high level. I just want to give one example that Matt England introduced yesterday in his Morton lecture, great lecture from Matt. He referred to some new research on ocean atmosphere coupling and interbasin research that is being coordinated and initiated to some degree by one of the WCRP core projects, that's CLIVAR. So that's an example of the kind of coordination of science that the WCRP do. Now, if you're not familiar with the WCRP, I just wanted to introduce you to our 4 ongoing core projects. So there's homes for this core capability, as well as this fundamental research. So CLIVAR, WCRP CLIVAR is our home for climate and ocean variability, predictability and change, with a focus on the coupled ocean atmosphere system. WCRP GWEX has a focus on the water cycles and the energy fluxes in the Earth's atmosphere and at the surface, and what that means for global change. CLIC, WCRP Climate and Cryosphere, is about improving our understanding of the cryosphere and its interactions with the global climate system. And then SPARC is focusing on the role of the atmosphere on climate variability and prediction. So that has a focus on dynamics and predictability, as well as chemistry and climate. So these 4 core projects have been enduring for some time. They've built important capability and research outcomes. They are linked. They have joint projects and joint panels. They don't exist as silos. Under our new strategy, we're augmenting these 4 ongoing core projects because there's other work that the WCRP have done through our working groups and councils and so forth that we want to strengthen and give some real focus and forward vision into the future because they're so critically important. So we've identified 2 new elements. This is the first on the screen in front of you. This brings together our Earth system modelling and observational capabilities. We're still deciding whether we'll call these a core project or a core program or something else. So we're still thinking about the name. They're very much under construction. But the important point is that they will unite and strengthen the work that's being done under our modelling and data advisory councils, under our critically important working groups on coupled modelling, numerical experimentation, and subseasonal to interdecadal prediction. And I just want to note that many in the audience might be familiar with CMIP, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. That is a hugely important flagship, if you like, project of WCRP, and that is run out of the working group on coupled modelling. So that work will continue, but we want to unite and strengthen it and give it some really forward vision. The second one reflects the importance of providing societally relevant climate information for regions. So again, this new element will unite and strengthen the work that's already being done under Cordex and under the working group on regional climate. These 2 new elements are very much under construction as we speak. There are task teams made up of these groups that you see on your screen, thinking about the science and the governance to take these forward, and also how we can make sure we've got mechanisms that provide the important linkages. The last thing I want to say on this slide is that many of you might be familiar with the WCRP Grand Challenges, which have been very important and around for many years now. These will sunset towards the end of 2022. By sunset, we mean that the science will either end because it's come to a natural conclusion and we will acknowledge and celebrate that amazing achievement appropriately, or that science and research will be transitioning into one of the other core activities. So how does this all fit together? I'll be quick on this slide because a structure slide is not everybody's cup of tea, but it is important to see how it connects, and that's what this slide is about. This is our new structure that we have developed in consultation across the WCRP leadership. We believe it's a more modernised and refined structure that's more fit for purpose to support our strategy going forward and deliver on those goals. It's been approved in principle. So from a governance perspective, the science direction is overseen by the JSC, the Joint Scientific Committee, you can see in the top. It's called joint because the WCRP have 3 co-sponsors, the WMO, the IOC and the ISC. We have our new Lighthouse activities that I've already talked about, and we have our core research communities and those core projects, the 4 ongoing ones and the new ones that I've just described. They are supported by our WCRP Secretariat that at the moment is based mostly in Geneva, although we do have support from some offices and other places for that Secretariat. And we have a series of international offices that support those core projects. And we're in the process of deciding how we can provide similar support to the new elements of our structure. But it's really important. On the right-hand side, you'll see a series of things called ongoing activities and fora. These are time-bound activities that we've always done in the WCRP, and they will continue in the future. But they're not owned by just one core project or by just one governance element. They typically are done together, jointly, or they might be initiated by the JSC or by the Secretariat. These are fixed-term projects, our conferences and workshops, building reference data sets or evaluations and benchmarking, building diversity and capacity building and so on. So they will continue into the future. So I want to wrap up now. This slide is a timeline because we're really doing what Detlef and I are calling a soft transition to this new WCRP. A soft transition means, and I'm quoting Detlef here, we're living in the new structure even though it's not fully designed and developed yet. So this is a bit of a timeline for that process. So it's a 2-year time frame to full operation, fully new WCRP structure by 2022. That means that we've got a really important series of consultations that we've been doing and will continue to do. And as I said in session 4, we'll talk more about that. We'll be designing and establishing through 2021 our 2 new core projects or core programs, whatever we're going to call them, those 2 new elements. We'll, through 2021, co-design and initiate the Lighthouse activities and transition those older elements that need to be transitioned. We're planning a second Open Science Conference in early 2023. The last one was in 2011 in Denver, and that will be a time to celebrate our achievements, the science that we've done, and essentially launch the new WCRP. And all of this will be supported by our implementation plan that will be a dynamic plan to ensure that it evolves as our needs evolve. So to finish, I just want to say that we can't do this alone. This has to be a collaborative effort. So the WCRP community stands ready to work with our co-sponsors and our partners and our nations to ensure that we're developing the climate knowledge and information that you need. It's also important that we engage with the next generation of scientists to improve and strengthen our diversity. That's across nations, across regions, and across disciplines, and across career stage as well. And there's work to be done, and we want to work with you to explore ways to better do that and to connect with you and to connect with the other disciplines that we need as well. And we'll start talking about that in session 4. But for now, I'm going to wrap up this part of the forum. And what will happen next is we're going to go to the 3 speakers, which will all reflect, I think, some important aspects for the WCRP and for Australia, I believe. And Julie will come on now, and I will finish sharing my screen. There will be an opportunity for discussion and Q&A after session 3. So thank you, and over to you, Julie.
Thanks very much, Helen, for that great overview, and thanks for all the work I know you do as Vice Chair of the Joint Steering Committee of WCRP. So I'm now going to introduce our first main speaker for the forum, which is Professor Christian Jakob from Monash University and the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. And Christian is one of the world's most respected climate modelers, and he has a long history of involvement with WCRP. He has previously been co-chair of the Global Energy and Water Cycle Experiment, GWEX, co-chair of the Modelling Advisory Council, and he's now co-chair of the Digital Earth's Lighthouse activity that Helen mentioned before. So for today's forum, we gave him the impossible task of talking about the future of Earth system modelling. It's a tall order, but I think Christian's up for it. So over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Julie. And it's great to not see you all, is what you say in these days, isn't it? 179 of you. I'm a little upset because there was 196 a few seconds ago. This is terrible. Yes, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk a bit about modeling. And of course, I was asked like 3 weeks ago, what's your title going to be? And Julie said, oh, let's do future of Earth system modeling. And we all know you write books about the future of Earth system modeling. You don't give 10-minute talks about the future of Earth system modeling. So I decided I will actually focus on a few aspects that have been sort of recently discussed. I'll touch on a lighthouse. And so that a better title perhaps is Some Challenges and Opportunities in Modeling Earth Climate. And Helen took my thunder away, sadly. Well, actually, I expected it. I wanted to ask all of you to name a modeling project associated with WCRP. And had you not named CMIP, you would have been in trouble. But that, since Helen pointed out to you that CMIP is actually a WCRP project, not many people know this. And without WCRP, there would have been no CMIP. So great achievement of WCRP. Since I'm going to be slightly talking about challenges, and therefore might come across quite critical of climate models, I want to remind you in my first slide of something very profound. And that is, climate models have been absolutely invaluable to what we have done over the past decades and learned about our climate over the past decades. And I would argue they've changed the world, right? I'll come back to this on the next slide. So on the left, you see this typical detection attribution work that asks, what if we had an alternative world in which greenhouse gases hadn't increased their concentration in the atmosphere thanks to human activity? What would that world look like? And we find it's a lot cooler, and we use this knowledge essentially brought to us by models, not models alone, but a lot of information from models that goes into that. And the right panel, I don't have to explain, that's the future. And there is no other real way of estimating what might happen in the future. Maybe for the variable shown there is, it's the global mean surface temperature. But for many of the other things we want to know, we have to rely on these climate models. However, something's happened over the last maybe 5 to 10 years. And that is because we were so successful, society is now demanding information on the future of our climate at an unprecedented level of detail, right? So the demand is now for very high spatial and temporal resolution. What will happen to our future climate? What will happen to extreme weather? What will happen to weather in general, you know, in Melbourne in 2050? What's the weather going to be like in Melbourne 2050? The success of climate models has actually culminated in the Paris Agreement. Do you think we would have signed the Paris Agreement and we would have set 2 degrees without all the climate modeling that was coordinated by the WCRP? I don't think so. But with that agreement, climate science has both been liberated, and I'll expand on that a little bit in my view, and has been thrown a huge new challenge, which we now have to respond to. The liberation is that we can stop talking about stuff we already know. And we really can. The Earth is warming, humans are responsible. Let's stop talking about that. We know, all right? And the Paris Agreement says we, the politicians of this world, acknowledge this. And we even further, we go one step further, we acknowledge we want to put a limit on it. However, that means climate science is over. If that's all they wanted to know, we would be over, but we're not. because there's so much more we need to know. So really the bar has been raised for us to now provide society with information that they need to make decisions on local scales for several decades to a century ahead, right? And many decisions that we do around weather and climate are very local in scale. So we really now have been asked to provide information. Most people think the motivation for this is just adaptation, but it's not. It's also mitigation. If you want to be carbon neutral by 2050, you will have to use renewable energy. If you want to use renewable energy, you better know where it's going to be windy and where it's going to be sunny. Will that change? Will that be in a different place in 2050 than it is right now? Do we have to plan for this? I would argue we do. And there's a few papers on the right. I'll come back to one of them. So now we have this demand, and actually for us to meet this demand brings up some really old questions and some really hard questions. The fact that they're still there means they're hard, because all the easy stuff we solve in a few years. It's the hard stuff that we haven't solved in 20, 30, 40 years. So one of them is around this issue is how's the weather going to change as the climate's changing, right? Most of the attention in that question is in extremes. You know, what's the future of extreme weather around the globe? And I bet you all of you have heard about this. But we had a discussion the other day and someone said, oh, what if we could just nail rainfall? Wouldn't that be nice? So rainfall is one of those things, right, where we really struggle in our climate models to provide more than, you know, very large scale average and very long time average information. You know, and you can take this a step further. What will happen to wind? What will happen to the sunshine that we need to produce solar energy? So these are very difficult, very tough questions for us to answer, and we will have to use models for them. And the models may not be up to that. So we wrote an article in 2017 that says climate research must sharpen its view, and that I really believe we do. And so there's a great challenge for all of us out here to actually follow the demands of society and do the research required to meet them. There's another question that frequently you hear asked, are we pushing the Earth towards some tipping points? Is there stuff in the system that will surprise us? We've had many surprises in the past. The hiatus was a surprise. No one predicted it. It happened, and then we spent time finding out what was going on. And then more recently, we are asking, spurred on by the Paris Agreement, you know, what type of climate change is avoidable? What is not avoidable? To make it avoidable, what would we have to do? All these questions require way more accuracy and way more information that we trust coming out of our climate models. Okay, so this is a challenge for everyone, not just for modeling. But if we use models to look into the future, it's a particular challenge for modeling. So the modeling capability that we need to develop over the next decade might be quite different from what we had imagined and what we have developed so far. We must acknowledge that. One bugbear of any modeler is that climate models have very large systematic errors, right? And they are large in the sense that they are as large as the signal that we're trying to predict. And that's a concern. So we'd like to do something. And we really don't fully understand what the consequence of having those errors is on the projections and predictions that we make, right? There's some understanding, but it's not very deep. We know the current models with their 100 to 150 kilometer grid boxes do not resolve some of the scales that are critical to weather. It's very likely, and has been demonstrated in some cases, contributes to these systematic errors that we're seeing in the climate models. Tipping points are usually all the ones I know about, and there aren't that many, it's not my field, but they all involve interactions, complex interactions of the many spheres that are involved in the climate system. Right, there's permafrost, and that's ice sheets, really complex things that we don't even fully understand how they work, let alone have models for and can simulate very well. Now, here's the dilemma as I see it. The most fun science is in that last point. You know, all these spheres interacting, us not knowing how that works. That's really fun. Let's go and work on it. Has anybody noticed that the big push in climate modeling over the last 10 years was to make better Earth system models, include more stuff? Of course, that's where the fun is. But is that the first two is probably the one society cares about the most right now. Okay, they do not care. They do care about ice sheets, but right now they want rainfall sorted out. And we know both of them are important, right? So we need to kind of find a way of navigating our way through this. And the question I would pose to get more attention to the first one, so far it's only scientists that set priorities for modeling. Maybe it's time that other people get to influence the priorities for modeling, not just through the scientist's brain, but much more directly. That's a very confronting thought, right? Because it pushes us out of our comfort zone as scientists, because we were the ones saying what should happen next in modeling. There's a paper that Tanja Fiedler led, and I had the pleasure to work with her and several others on. And I finagled it that it comes out on my birthday, which was on Monday. So it actually came out on my birthday, which is very nice. But in that paper, we postulate, and I very strongly believe this, is that we will not meet society's demand for climate information, especially about the future, if we take a research-only approach to climate modeling. Now, this a little bit takes us off the World Climate Research Program, because that's about research. But it's important to realize that maybe research only is not sufficient to meet society's demand, because that makes us think about how we interact with what isn't research. On the left-hand side is kind of the status quo. We do climate research. Out of that climate research comes lots of stuff, but this is about models. So regional models, global models, they are all designed for research. Any CMIP paper you go and read about the construction of CMIP and so on, you will find it's a research effort. There's no mention of this data being used for prediction and projection or used by users. In this paper with Tanja at the helm, and Nick, who will talk to you later, was involved in it as well, was thinking about the interaction of climate models and business. And here's how it works right now. So we have all this research, then we have some scenarios, we make all these runs, we put them in an archive, and we say, there you go, it's all there, just take it. You want to make decisions? Go over there. If you don't understand something, come and talk to us, but we're kind of busy, so keep the questions short. Imagine we did weather forecasting like this, right? All the world weather forecasting centers run their models, they dump the data somewhere and say, there you go, have fun. So I think we really need a paradigm shift. And the picture on the right, both of these are in the paper if you want to read more. The picture on the right is really trying to articulate this a little bit. We really need a paradigm shift. First, the demand of the user has to drive as much of what we do as our own curiosity, which of course will always drive what we want to do. The models there has to be an intermediate phase, just like there's in weather prediction, in that there has to be an operational model. And that has so many positive side effects if you try and do that. For education, it has super positive side effects for communication of the results, for rigor. If you have an operational model, you want to update it, you need to decide, is the next version I have better? How do you decide that for a climate model? It's a really challenging task. The WCRP, again, has a few efforts to think about this, but it's really challenging. And then the output of the models can't just be given to the businesses directly. There has to be a weather forecaster equivalent, if you wish, a group of people who are trained to interpret this really complex and really huge amount of information comes from the models for individual users, including the public, right? So weather forecaster equivalents, we called them climate translators. We didn't come up with a better name. There's probably a much better name for them. All right. This slide you've already seen. I just wanted to highlight that pretty much in each of these lighthouse activities, so the response of the WCRP to these challenges is we need to do something new. We can't just carry on as normal. And what's grown out of this discussion are these 5 lighthouse activities. And each of them pretty much, and the academy even, because it needs to train people to understand what climate models can and cannot do, are related to modeling. That's all I wanted to bring out in this slide. I wanted to have one very high-level slide on the digital Earth one, because it's such a nebulous concept for a lot of people. And it is because it's really cool and it's really hard. And so a lot of people say, forget it, it's too hard. The idea is that you use modern technology, modern computing, modern data technology, modern observations, and modern models, and you bring them together. Very likely those models are at kilometer scale, coupled eventually, right? And you do a couple of things with them. We want to comprehensively describe the state of the system. We want to predict where it's going. And we want to understand why it's going there and explain it to others, including developing storylines for users, where the climate system might go. We want to use it for science, obviously. And we want to provide an infrastructure in which this can all work. But the difference is this is to be the system of systems once it's finished in about 100 years. Oh no, hopefully less than 100. Let's say a decade or two. In that, it really brings together Earth system modeling with data assimilation, with impact modeling, with uncertainty estimation, with the observations of the Earth. And it brings them together with modern technology, right? There's been big revolutions in technological things that most of us are even very unfamiliar with. And it creates what we call a digital twin of the Earth, a digital copy of what's actually going on, ideally including not just natural systems, but that's sort of the last, the big barrier will be, how do we include human systems in this? But imagine we could. And then provides a digital interface to the user where they can really probe and pull out information that they need, and in between them could sit a climate service. So to do this, we are going to propose, very likely out of this Digital Earth activity, that the WCRP take on a few new challenging projects. One will be, how do we do global kilometer scale coupled modeling, including all spheres? Imagine the computers were there. Tomorrow someone gives you a computer that works. What wouldn't work? It's kind of the question the WCRP needs to take on. What wouldn't we be able to do? We need to do a better job at merging observations and models. So that's data assimilation. There's a huge challenge around how you do that with a good infrastructure, especially if you want to do it at kilometer scale. And how do we design this with users in mind? Our climate models are not designed with users in mind. They are designed with scientists in mind. Okay, and then I've already talked about this. I feel that there's a huge organizational challenge ahead. The WCRP can't solve that, but it can influence it. In that, really, we need to elevate climate modeling from the research activity that it is to the operational activity that society needs. So here on the right is Christian's dreamland. What would be the ideal climate modeling landscape in 2030? And I'll finish on this one. So I imagine we would have these digital Earth, digital twin systems, and we would have about 3 at most by 2030, in about 10 years' time. You do data assimilation, prediction, everything coupled at a kilometer scale. Might be 2 or 3 kilometers instead of 1. Around them would sit national and regional operational modeling centers. They would probably run global models on the order of 10 kilometers, and these are all orders, and Earth system models, more involving more spheres that matter to the climate, about 100 kilometers. And they would probably all have regional digital twins. So this sort of digital description of what's going on in the system could be regionalized, why not? And then around this would be the freed up community of research, because you may not like this idea. Many people hate this idea of operationalizing climate modeling, but you should all love it as scientists, because the amount of time that scientists spend not doing science in climate modeling is huge. And that's because these operational duties of providing simulations, checking that the data is all that is currently done by scientists, which means they won't do science. They can't. They have no time to do science. So it will be a liberation for our community if we could pull this off. Last slide. So what? Why would you be interested in anyway? It's all cloud cuckoo land anyway, isn't it? This 1 kilometer stuff will never work. Well, I would like to tell you the EU is funding it already. It's called Destination Earth. You can look it up on the internet. I put a little excerpt there. And really, my closing comment is there's a revolution in climate modeling just around the corner. And it's enabled both by science that we've done over the past 2 decades and technology. It's going to be hugely challenging, but it's also going to be very exciting. And if you are in any way, shape, or form interested, you should come and join the fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. So we will take 1 or 2 very quick questions and very quick answers. So the first one, I'll read out quickly. Christian is from Angela Maharaj. And she says, in the medical research community, there is a move towards independent laboratories which run experiments designed by other researchers. Labs have no skin in the game for papers, etc., and provide additional independence and integrity. Is there room for something like this in climate modeling?
Yes, I think you will find the EU project Destination Earth is very much built with this in mind. So the idea is once you have the digital infrastructure that runs the models, in principle, user X can come along and say, I'm interested in this, and I'm even interested to run my own little scenario. What if in my country we doubled our solar power generation? What are the consequences of that, right? And if behind completely obscure to the user, the system would try and work some of that out. So yes, so in a sense, if it was very successful, it's been pitched to the funders in that way, that actually the user interaction will be part of the system. It's not something you do afterwards.
Okay, great. And then one from Will Howard about tipping points. He says, though these are compelling points of concern scientifically, they remain somewhat elusive. In particular, the GCMs that have been the main tools of climate projections do not generally show these. Do we need to move to a different type of model to examine the risks of tipping points?
That's entirely possible. As I said, it's not my area. A lot of them involve biological systems or cryospheric systems that we haven't spent much time thinking about. A lot of them are on quite long time scales, but very important. And a lot of it is research. So my sense is that that part is where physical climate modeling, for lack of a better word, where it was just the land, the ocean, the atmosphere, started 40 years ago. Earth system modeling started 10, 20 years ago, right? And so we have more time in the Earth system modeling space to still work out what's the best approach to this. In the physical modeling space, which is sort of what we use to look a few decades ahead, which is, by the way, where many users are very interested, between now and 2050, 2060, say, without losing sight of what happens after, but really focused on these. I think we are much more mature, and it's time to bring this maturity to society, actually, and not just hide it in our research world.
Great, thanks, Christian. We'll save the rest of the questions for the Q&A at the end, but please continue to upvote them. And thank you, Christian, for a very thought-provoking and fabulous talk. I'll now hand over to Lisa to introduce our next speaker. Thanks, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Julie, and thanks very much, Christian, for that. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick, who's going to talk to us today about what WCRP has done or not done for her as an early to mid-career researcher. So it's fair to say that Sarah is really, the country's go-to expert in heatwave research, and she's contributed enormously to scientific communication. She's an ARC Future Fellow, and until last week, she was based at UNSW Sydney, but as of this week, she's moving to the School of Science at UNSW Canberra. Regarding her international activities, she was on the Council of Yes, that's the Early Career Scientist Committee of Earth System Science in 2016 and 2017, and she's now co-chair of the Early Career Scientist Network within IMAS, and this is the Association of Atmospheric Science within IUGG. And just to point out that this is the first time that this Early Career Scientist Committee has been put together. She also sits on WMO steering committees for marine meteorology and oceanography and climate. And it's my great pleasure to introduce her today. Thank you, Sarah.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Yes, so as Lisa mentioned, I'm going to talk about what WCRP has done for me, and this includes early career, so I guess doing my PhD and the first few years of my career, and I guess, yeah, now I'm a mid-career, so I'll talk what WCRP is or isn't doing for my career currently. So when Lisa asked me to give this talk just before Christmas, I kind of had the thought that WCRP was just basically a bunch of more senior scientists than myself sitting in a room, or as COVID probably has enforced, on Zoom, discussing what we all should be working on. So I guess my point of view was WCRP was a very top-down organisation, which I'm not trying to discount that. There's a lot of good things that have come out of that, but I was kind of sitting there thinking, well, but what has WCRP really done for me? And, you know, what has it got to do with someone like myself who's an early / mid-career scientist? But I got thinking, and there's actually a few points I want to talk about. I think about 7 I've got in here about what WCRP has done for my career in general. So the first is the one that Lisa mentioned. I was on the YES Council. So YES stands for Young Earth System Science Community. This is a really good opportunity. So this kind of came about. Christian was actually a link in this process. This came about, I saw a call out from Cliver, which is one of the core groups of WCRP, which I'll go into a bit later, that they're wanting to set up an ECR committee. And it just so happened that this was being talked about, and Christian had mentioned that there was this group of scientists in Germany who had this Earth System group for ECRs. And this was an opportunity to partner with them and to make YES, broadcast it, if you will, across the world. So this is just one of the ECS networks that WCRP supports. This is for mainly the Cliver group of scientists. There are others for the different core projects. But yeah, it was a really good opportunity. I unfortunately didn't really benefit in the sense of what things they offer now. So I was very much in the startup of this this community, and I was part of the first group of international council members. I'm no longer on this panel because I'm no longer an ECR. Nina Ritter is actually the representative for the Australasian region these days. But there's lots of resources, there's lots of online forums, job adverts, that sort of thing on the YES community. So if you haven't heard of YES, here's a plug for it. But this was certainly something that WCRP offered for me that I probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But this kind of leads me on to mid-career support. So I guess this is where I sit now. I feel like in some ways it's a bit of a no person's land. I obviously don't need as much skills support. I can go for jobs, I can go for research grants. That's all fine, and I clearly don't need a new job. But then I'm also not senior enough to be making the big decisions and determining if we're using lighthouse projects or grand challenges or that sort of thing. I'm not sure, though, on the other hand, what WCRP should be doing in this space. I really tried hard to think about that and at least give some sort of recommendations, but none of them really came to mind. I did think, well, hey, I need to take some initiative and, get involved with WCRP. So when I looked at the website, this is really the only, very general blurbs on the right here that kind of came up that, they're scientists, and if you're interested, subscribe to the news, which I did. Sure, I maybe just did that this morning, but you can still do that. But there wasn't really anything else out there that really kind of think, well, you're at this stage, this is how you can be involved with WCRP. There are panels. If you go to the core groups, there are panels that you can join. So these are the list of the Cliver panels that currently exist, and these are the list of the GWEX panels that currently exist. So I'll speak a bit later about my current identity crisis, but looking at these panels, I personally don't fit into any, and that's fine. I don't, that's not always going to be the case where I slot nicely into something. But it also begged the question, well, how are these panels formed? Who decides when they go into their sunset period, so to say? How do you get on them? There are, on the Cliver page, there was advice that they come up, membership comes up for a 3-year membership every 12 months or so, but it seemed a bit of a black box as to what you needed to do to get on that panel. Kind of thinking, was it a bit of more, not what you know, but who you know, and probably not, but this wasn't abundantly clear when trying to do a bit more research on, the next stage of my career in conjunction with WCRP. So the second thing that WCRP has given me is a lot of data to analyse, and both Christian and Helen have already touched on this, that the coupled model intercomparison project, otherwise known as CMIP, has been absolutely fundamental for my research. Basically, I wouldn't have a PhD or a career if it wasn't for this data set. This has, you know, defined my entire career today, and probably will define my entire career. So this started back all the way back in CMIP 3. So I guess this is really showing my age, where I interrogated the CMIP models to understand extremes over Australia. Then throughout my DECRA and my future fellowship, I've looked at heat waves and how they're changing globally and over Australia. And then more recently, CMIP 6, we've started to probe that into heat wave evaluation. A lot of people don't actually know that WCRP have pushed or, you know, funded and support CMIP. I knew this way back when I started my PhD, it was more commonly known then, but I think a lot of the ECRs coming through now don't actually realise the weight that firstly CMIP has, and secondly the, you know, integral role WCRP have. But it's really important. You know, this does pertain to my career, but there's also lots of other data resources out there that would support lots of other people sitting on this chat, this webinar. The third way that WCRP has supported my career is measuring the climate. So many of you have probably heard of the ETCC-DI indices. They were originally commissioned by the World Meteorological Organization, but it's actually now in partnership with WCRP. WMO has just undergone this major restructuring, but now it's WCRP that's carrying these indices through and continuing that sort of support. So these are really cool. You can literally log online to Clindex and pull out your favorite index and see how it's changed globally and whether or not those changes are significant. I've been involved in studies that look at the time of the emergence of certain climate extremes. And I've also got a current PhD student. He presented a talk earlier this week, Pete, looking at how these indices have changed in CMIP 5 relative to CMIP 6. And these indices are fantastic. They're standardized, they were put together by a team of experts, and they give us a solid, systematic understanding of how climate extremes have changed and will change in the future. So this is, again, something that's quite core to my work on climate extremes. It looks like I can't count because we're now up to number 5. I don't know what happened to number 4. Another thing that WCRP have provided for me is lots of different networking, lots of networking opportunities. One of the best conferences I've been to was the GWEX conference. I actually didn't think it would be appropriate to me. I was actually very late in getting my abstract through because I actually didn't think my science really belonged in GWEX. So I kind of, you know, threw it out to begin with. But as I, you know, heard who was going and what the topics would be, then, you know, I saw this as a really fantastic conference. It's not abundantly clear to me, maybe I've just had my head in the sand, how many of these sorts of conferences that WCRP do actually support, and if these things are regular, if they come up just as the need arises. But I would certainly like to see more of these opportunities out there. And perhaps, you know, maybe I do have my head in the sand a lot of the time, but perhaps these need to be better broadcast so they are more regularly taken up by early and mid ECR researchers. Something else that came out of this was a workshop I attended with Lisa. She ran it in Guayaquil in Ecuador in 2013, where we delivered some sector-specific climate indices to stakeholders. So these sector-specific indices are also supported by WMO. It's a joint partnership. But it was really interesting to experience and to help put the science back into stakeholders' hands and work with them. So, as I mentioned earlier, WCRP does seem like a top-down approach, but it was actually good to see it actually going all the way down and not just sticking with the scientists to go into the stakeholders' hands. And I really enjoyed that opportunity. And again, I think it's something that WCRP should maybe consider doing more of in the future. Oh, here we go. We're at to number 4. Okay, clearly I can't count. So I've actually found that these big science questions really useful, and I'm a bit sad to hear that they're in their sunset phase now. The grand challenges have really helped me keep my science focused and to see where it's going. It's actually kind of nice to know, because one of the grand challenges is surprise, weather and climate extremes, and there's something on heat waves there, so lucky me. But it was good to see, okay, yes, what I'm doing fits in with a larger objective. It fits in with what needs to be addressed and what needs to be solved. And there's many other people who also find this work interesting and useful, really. So I really enjoyed having those questions, and I hope that, yeah, something like this continues in the future. I guess just, you know, something that I thought of, well, is this really monitored? Do we really know? Here are the questions, and I've heard them broadcast many times, but do we really know who's doing what where, and what, you know, is it sort of maintained, or is there a database somehow where we can kind of see the progress, or who's publishing what, or what workshop addressed which issues, and, you know, what came out of that sort of process. So I think that would be good to kind of document the progresses of these grand challenges, at least in a more accessible way, because I couldn't really find too much about it on the WCRP website. Something else that really that WCRP provided for me, which I certainly was not expecting, was a one-off ECR opportunity to become part of this paper that Christian actually mentioned in his talk. I actually felt really dwarfed by being part of this paper. It just came out, David Carlson, who works for Cliver, approached me, I think, because of my work with Yes, and said that they wanted an ECR perspective of where climate research should go in the future. Which was a fantastic opportunity, but I'm sure you can see the names there on the papers. And I was by far the youngest person in the room, which it was a fantastic experience. And I was really, I guess, humbled to be part of such an important paper to actually say, well, you know, these are the bigger questions. We're not just talking about the short-term grand challenges. There's also bigger issues that we need to be thinking about in the next couple of decades. So this was brilliant for me. And as I mentioned, this came out of Cliver. But yeah, I do kind of wonder if that's because of where I was sitting with the ECR work. Again, a little bit of not what you know, but who you know. Again, I relished the opportunity and really enjoyed it. But I can't help but wonder, maybe someone else should have been involved in that too, or instead of me. Okay, again, I still can't count. It looks like my 3-year-old put numbers on these slides. Something that I really can't get my head around, and I struggle with this every time, is my identity within WCRP. They have 4 core research programs. They have these grand challenges. They have unifying themes. And as Helen mentioned, now we're moving to lighthouse projects. So I kind of really struggle to think, okay, well, where do I sit? Where can I kind of focus and target my research? As mentioned, I have really benefited from the grand challenges the most. But even looking at the core projects, looking at Cliver, well, I kind of really don't sit there because I'm not looking at predictability and variability, but also I'm not a solid GWEX person either. So I do fit into one of the grand challenges, but of course they're about to disappear. So it's kind of hard to keep that focus going. Again, I don't really have a solution, I'm sorry to say, but it is something that I've certainly noticed that it's a bit of a, it is a bit of an identity crisis of where exactly do I sit, and how can I contribute to WCRP as it, moves forward and evolves, I guess. So I guess going on from that identity crisis, I do sometimes have a bit of a headache. So this is old now, this, the program picture on the left, going from what Helen was showing in her talk. So you have a look at this structure, and you can see the grand challenges and their core projects there, and the joint scientific committee is obviously at the top. But how do the working groups fit in? How do these advisory councils fit in? How does the secretariat, what do they do, and how do they play into all of this? And then if you go into the core projects, they also have their own structures. So up the top is the Cliver one. I couldn't, unfortunately, access GWEX's one, so I just took a pretty picture from the website, but they also have their own structure. And it, can give me a bit of a headache, and I'd say it gives me more of a headache than what my toddler used to give me when she was teething, and that was a pretty big headache. So just to summarise, upon reflection, WCRP has provided a lot for my career, and I'm really grateful for that. It wasn't always immediately obvious, and I don't think it always will be immediately obvious, but there is a lot that WCRP has done to define my career. As mentioned a few times, it's mostly top-down organisation. Again, that's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but perhaps there needs to be more of a bottom-up focus as well, and that kind of goes back to the workshop in Ecuador that I was in with Lisa. It's great to see that, over recent years, there has been a heightened focus on ECRs, but there is this kind of no person's land of what comes after that. There's no clear pathway from an ECR to potentially wanting to be on the Joint Scientific Committee. Some processes don't always seem to be transparent, they just seem to happen. So it'd be good to kind of have a bit more of a structure there, just so we, if you do have a goal of being on the JSE and, eventually being in Helen's position one day, that there's at least some sort of pathway to get there. There is, I didn't touch on this earlier, but there is certainly an element of yet another hierarchy. So there's IMAS and WMO as well, and also a lot of other acronyms that naturally come from that. However, we'll just say that WCRP, at least this hierarchy, doesn't seem to be as confusing as involved with some other organisations. And with that, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. We do actually have some questions and comments in the Q&A, but I know that Nick, who's our next speaker, has to leave at 3:30. So what I might do is pass on to Helen to introduce him, and we'll take the questions at the end, Sarah, if that's okay. All right. Okay, thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'll quickly get to introducing Nick. I'm really delighted that he's going to talk to us in this final slot. Nick comes to us as a director of his own company, Climate Policy Research Pty Limited. He's also an associate with a consulting company called Energetics, and he's been on the stakeholder advisory group for the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub, and he's worked across many aspects of climate change policy, providing strategic consultancy style advice and services to a number of public and private sector organisations. They include major Australian corporations, which I think is where he's going at 3:30, to CSIRO, where I work, and to the Clean Energy Regulator. And he provides a fantastic link between the climate science world that many of us live in and what the needs are of the private sector. So with no further ado, over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Hello, apologies for the slight technicals. A real pleasure to be here. This is a very, very important time for climate science and its interface with business. And there's an awful lot going on in this space. And I just want to give you a quick overview snapshot of where we're at. I know there's some people on this call who are absolutely fundamental to what we're doing. So I really appreciate their efforts to date. Next slide, please. Okay, next one. So basically, where are we now? Corporate Australia is facing some fundamental drivers on climate change and climate risk that it's not had to deal with before, and they come in three sorts. Basically, the financial risks, which is really driven by the global central banks who look at the Paris target and go, how are we going to do that? How are we going to ensure financial stability? You've then got the actual investor scrutiny, because we've all got savings funds and various bank accounts. So the big investors are going, okay, what sort of economy are we going to have in sort of between now and 2050? And then of course we've actually got the reality. We've got changes in oil price, we've got bushfires, we've got floods, we've got the lived experience of people that climate change is starting to affect their daily lives and their views of the future. So it's these three things are coming together in a kind of like very dangerous nexus. Next slide, please. The way to kind of think about the world that we live in and the world that sort of certainly more and more bringing you people into is really that it's about the sort of financial view of risks and opportunities, and the bucket phrase for that is climate intelligence. Now, you just took a snapshot of the Australian economy. You've basically got three parts. You've got what's called the real economy, which is households, which is us. You've got the big corporates, providing goods and services, and you've got the sort of financial intermediaries and regulators, banks, insurers, super funds, all the rest of it. All of those are financial flows. Essentially, in every one of those financial flows, there's going to need to be a climate risk price decision. Do you lend to somebody if they're a risky outcome? Do you insure an asset if it's a risky asset to insure? What level of equity in debt would you like to take on in exposure to various different climate risks? So early stages, but essentially each one of those money flows is going to have a climate price actually then built into it over the next sort of 10 to 20 years. Next slide, please. It's really about following the money. So this is just a screenshot of the Queensland Treasury Corp state borrowing for Queensland. So the numbers at the bottom basically should add up to about $90 billion, and those are government debts to Queensland, which are outdated out to about 2034. There are longer dated ones. So you think, hang on, $90 billion repayable over the next like 15, 20 years. What sort of climate impact, what sort of effect will the climate have on the economy of Queensland by the time you get to 2035, 2040? And that's a very taxing question. And that's where the big credit rating agencies and the big global money markets go, what's going to happen? So if you want a kind of cheeky way of thinking about this, you go, well, if you've got no coal and no coral and no cows and no koalas, why do you want credit? So there's some pretty serious implications here, and it's that macroeconomic impact of climate change which is really taxing the central bankers and the RBA and APRA and stuff as we speak today. Next slide, please. And this is just economic reality. What we're basically facing here is as climate change starts to impact economies and GDP and employment and capital deployment and various other things, you're still going to start to get higher cost of capital, risky lending, less ability to repay it, less economic growth as climate change starts to reduce economic growth. And you start to get some pretty serious situations, particularly on sort of developing nations that are heavily exposed, and they're going to be paying a lot for their borrowing, and that means that their economic growth is going to be stymied, and their social welfare is going to be jeopardized. So this is a big deal. This is something that global capital markets are rapidly kind of to take it on board as an issue. Next slide, please. If we go back 10 years, alarmism about climate change, what was labelled as alarmism was really the Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, various other people, and then climate scientists. That's not true today. You now have very, very eminent central bankers and economists going, you need to do something, and you need to do something fast. Mark Carney, who's a former governor of the Bank of England, this is not a lightweight view of climate risk. This is a highly qualified central banker going, this is a problem, and we need to engage with it across all fronts. Next slide, please. Okay. The type of work we actually do is it's pretty easy to sort of categorize. We very heavily leverage the IPCC frameworks. We've got three buckets. We've got the climate hazard, which is natural variability and the anthropogenic change. We've got climate vulnerability, which is how does it break, in very simple terms. When we've got the exposure, where is it? And when you're working through those three cycles, most of our work in the corporate sector fits pretty neatly into those kind of three buckets. The hard yards are actually about doing the underlying work and building the analysis, and as picking up on earlier comments from Christian, not overstressing the science. The input science, the intelligence of the science is very, very important. We don't want to get this wrong, basically. Next slide, please. Just to like to introduce you to one of the few pieces of the work that's in the public domain. There's a lot that's not, but this was a piece of work that Helen herself was closely involved in initiating 2 years ago. We carried out for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Very well funded, very detailed piece of climate research. We brought the climate scientists directly into the meetings and into the work delivery. You can read this in the actual 2019 Commonwealth Annual Report. It was on agriculture. It was about their agriculture book, and it was about the risks that climate change poses to their agriculture and future lending. So went through a range of different sort of workflows, but it's as per that diagram. It's climate hazard, it's vulnerability, it's exposure, and then it's what is the risk. Next slide, please. So you'll be far more familiar with this than me. This is just a screenshot from Climate Change Australia for 2030, 2070 rainfall in southeast Australia. This is the Australian wheat belt. This is the southeast Australian wheat belt around on the Victorian South Australian border. We're just basically, okay, what's the worst outcome? You're looking at a change in rainfall patterns, particularly winter rainfall patterns, which is important to agriculture and to grain growth. What does that do to farming and profitability in that area? Next slide, please. So we took the rainfall data with the worst case, and we combined it with some very, very detailed vulnerability response data from ABARES. They've got very good data sets, 30 odd years with the farm data for profitability against temperature, rainfall, and essentially with that allowed us to build a sensitivity. We know how the crops respond. We know how we've got a view of what the climate could do in the future. In a worst case, if we stick all those things together, what do we get? So next slide, please. So basically, what we get is a series of maps. So the top line is basically we looked at grains, we looked at livestock, and looked at dairy. So if we look at the middle one, which is livestock, the worst case outcome in 2060, that's mostly driven by change in rainfall, was that basically livestock farming across wide swathes of Australia was no longer profitable. And that concerns the bank because they lend to these people. So, okay, that was only half the story. How do you fix it? Well, agriculture responds very well to adaptation techniques, genetic breeding, new crop varieties, a whole range of things. So if you deployed sufficient capital, deployed sufficient investment and research, you can turn a lot of that brown to green. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And that's the positive story. And that's where you start to look at opportunities. It's like, how do we fix this? There's no point just flagging up risks. How do we fix it? We're going to need food. We're going to need employment. What do you do about it? So in that little snapshot, I've just walked you through the climate hazard, the vulnerability assessment, the exposure, combined to give you the risk and the opportunity that comes along with it. And again, you can look this up yourself. It's in the CBA annual report, but this is only one of 20 or 30 projects that we're actually currently engaging with clients and also engaging with the CSIRO. So next slide, please. I called it climate intelligence and a climate intelligence arm race. And again, picking up on a point that Christian made, the climate scientists, there are other big beasts moving into this world. What you're looking at here is basically alliances between very, very big capital markets players. BlackRock owns 7% of the whole world in terms of investments. Moody's are a very, very influential credit rating firm. Insurers, Morgan Stanley Composite Index, they're all big players in the sort of financial capital markets, and they're teaming up with climate specialists, climate and technology providers, Carbon Delta, XDI, DAS, all those sort of people. So what we're seeing in the private sector is this arms race where the big finance capital markets are building up their capability to do climate risk and opportunity analytics. And just on to the next slide, please. So just to pick up on that, it was a fabulous experience for me to work with the eminent climate scientists here, and basically accountants, journalists, climate scientists, and little old me. And this paper came out yesterday, Nature Climate Change, and it deals head on with how you use climate science to inform financial risk analysis. And it's already been very well received, and it's a very interesting expanding area. I mean, you'll hear a lot more about this in the next couple of months, because we know that the Australian prudential regulators are trying to develop basically a risk assessment for the Australian finance sector under climate change. Very timely, fabulous going to work with the climate science, and it's just got a very long way to go before we actually sort of nail this capabilities. And I'm really looking forward to using some of the new data that you've been talking about. Next slide, please. There you go. Thank you very much. Apologies for the small technical hitch at the beginning, but thanks for Christian for his help. Over to you, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And yes, thanks, Christian, for coming to our rescue. And we are going to lose Nick. I want to just very quickly not only thank him, but explain that the whole reason we wanted Nick to talk today is we talk in the climate research community about informing risk, but there's nothing like having a real live example from someone who's actually doing that. Nick, do you have time for one quick question, if there is one? Yep, his thumbs up. Moderators, Lisa and Julie, were there any questions to Nick? I've been too busy.
Yes, we have one from Peter Degorski. So he's saying, hi, Nick. What about the climate services for the part of Australian private sector in Australia, which is non-corporate, e.g. SME?
So just repeat that. I just broke up slightly.
So hi, Nick. Clear perspective of how climate science impacts corporate Australia. What about the climate services for the part of Australian private sector in Australia, which is non-corporate, e.g. SME?
Yeah, interesting point. So the SMEs, what we suspect will happen is they'll just be information takers. So we'll see a sort of we're likely to see an expansion of climate services, and as they get expanded and more refined, hopefully the price will come down, and there'll be intermediaries, probably insurance firms and others that will start to sort of assist in that way. And we also know that some of the big banks are building up their ability to engage with SMEs via credit risk and various other things. So SMEs will be information takers, but we predict they will be serviced in the sort of next to sort of 3 to 5 years. Thanks.
And maybe I could just follow up with that good question, Peter, and your answer, Nick, in that wearing my CSIRO hat, I know that there's discussions happening in CSIRO about how we can build that ecosystem that brings in the role that the SMEs can play. So I think that's a very live, fair to say it's a live discussion at the moment about the role that they can play. Yeah. Were there any other? I know we're going to lose you, Nick. So perhaps now this is a good example that not only can we not count, but we're not very good at keeping time, because we've actually consumed our entire discussion effort on the talks. But if we can, and we've been given more time, if we can eat into your afternoon tea a little bit, we're going to go straight to some questions, and we'll take some of those questions, and then I've just got one slide that I want to finish on before you all lose, I lose you all and disappear, which is how you can connect with us and what we do after today. But maybe I'll hand over to Lisa and Julie they've been sorting through the questions.
Okay. Okay, Helen, there's one for you from David Crowley. How can WCRP support scientists who are seeking funding from national science agencies when WCRP doesn't provide any research funding itself? And he has another part to the question, but I'll let you answer that first.
Okay, cool. So it's a good question, David. Thank you. And in fact, the way I'd like to answer that is actually look forward in a what-if sense as to how we could do better. So if we were perhaps better coordinated, say in Australia, because that's the audience today, where the science agencies and the funders and WCRP had already had some discussions about what was important, then maybe we could, because as you said, the WCRP doesn't provide a lot of funding, we can provide some, but maybe we can come together to say, well, how can we support activities that are of importance to Australia in this example, and the climate agencies in Australia, and also for the WCRP. So I think this is part of why we're having these discussions actually, and this is the first one, about how can we work together to provide the resources that we need so that we are better engaging. But that said, the WCRP themselves are also working hard at the moment to grow our resource base as well, so that we can better support our engagement with nations who might not have a lot of resources themselves. So I think it's a good question, and I think it has to be part of the conversation going forward.
Okay, thanks, Helen. We've got one for Christian from Christine Killip. So, as someone sitting in the space between the climate projection data and businesses asking questions about the future, the idea of operationalising the climate modelling is very exciting. How do you see the role of the private sector in your new plan?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think some of the really big picture stuff that we would like to achieve, this sort of digital twin, imagine there was a digital Australia, I think can only be built in private-public partnership. You cannot go to the government and say, fund us, we're great, right? And we would like this. It has to be, if we design the next generation climate modeling effort, and I mean by that, put all the science and the technology, the systems and the service in a holistic way, based on the user needs, the user needs to come to the table. It won't work any other way, I don't think. And of course, the way it often works, one has to demonstrate that it can work first. And this is where these great funding efforts by the EU, for instance, will be of great help. I mean, we're really looking forward to seeing what those sorts of systems can deliver, and also learn what they might not be able to deliver, and use that as a sort of prototype to go out and say, you know, we want one of those. Yeah, that's probably. So I think there was another question, I think, by Matt asking, will governments listen? Will the government listen if we go? And I think if we go with give us money to do a bit more than what we've been doing the last 40 years, absolutely not, they won't. But if we give them this really great vision that has realism behind it, right? Which I think there's a lot of cynicism about high resolution modeling, won't work, can't run enough ensembles, all that sort of stuff in the community. Well, if we keep saying that, we will not get funded. And I think it's not true either, because none of us can predict what we can do in 2030. But we have to have a target what we want to do in 2030, and that will drive the technological progress as much as we can, as we can't sit there wait for technological progress. We have to drive it in the ways that we need. If climate change is as big a thing as everybody says it is, the funding should be easy. I know it's not, but it should be.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Talking of issues around climate change, Sarah, a question for you from David Crowley. How did you calculate your personal CO2 emissions associated with all your WCRP climate conference flights since you were a PhD student? And is Zoom a good or a bad solution to this?
Trust David to ask the hard questions. No, I haven't calculated my emissions. It's probably something that I should do and compare it to a year of no flying. Zoom absolutely has a space for this. There are a lot of groups, ECR groups and non-ECR groups, that do a lot of virtual webinars, and if you can't attend because of the time zone, you can easily catch up on recordings, and they do help with networking and getting the science out. But I think, like most people as well, COVID has also taught us that it is, having some sort of face-to-face interaction is really important, both for the science and both for building those connections and networking, and it's an ECR propelling your career. So yes, we shouldn't be traveling as much. And yeah, there would have been a lot of emissions from my WCRP work, I guess. So there is a space that Zoom can fill there, but I don't think it can fill the entire space if we didn't travel at all anymore. But then again, I'm saying that I don't know what could.
And can I just thank Sarah, and I just want to jump in from a WCRP perspective. We're actually taking this issue very seriously, having learned through the year of COVID to think very carefully about the kinds of meetings where we absolutely have to have face-to-face and the ones that we can do it by video. And that's actually an active working group and discussion within the WCRP right now. And we'll come out with some targets and recommendations over the next year. So,
cool. Okay, the next question is from Giovanni Liguri. And if any of you can answer that, is the CMIP factory also a kind of procrastination for scientists?
I wouldn't quite use that word, but it is, like all of us, we're creatures of comfort. And once we're comfortable in a certain mode of operating, it's very hard for us to see that there could be a different one. And I think CMIP has achieved great things for not just science, but mankind. And I mean that, for the entire planet. But it's time for the next step. And the discussion we need to have, and Helen might tell you, we're planning a workshop on this in the WCRP. The question that we have is, can we achieve our target of serving society by just carrying on? Or is there something else we need to do? And I think we have to have that discussion. It hasn't been had yet. We don't know. I have my views, and I gave them to you today, but they are my views, right? So other people may disagree. And I see a massive role for CMIP in the future to continue the research effort, because there'll be a lot of climate research going on. But to provide information to users, we may need to take a different approach. And so the two may not be the same thing anymore. And that might be a very good thing for the science, right? That we do not have to be pressured for delivery. What we will deliver is new models for the operational services to deliver products. That's the vision I have for the future. But whether that is one that others will share, I don't know.
Okay, thanks very much, Christian. And actually, I'm going to pose the next question to you as well. I'm going to try and consolidate two people's questions in one. So one from Thomas Remeni. Christian, I love the idea of operationalizing climate science. Sign me up. What organizations could own this operational climate service? And how could these be built? How could you build an organization to avoid the challenges of the current organizations and forecast operational systems?
Okay, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
First of all, please do not operationalize climate science. That's not going to work. Science cannot be operationalized. What we want to operationalize is that little bit of climate science, which is using models to make predictions and projections. That's what we want to operationalize. And it's going to sit on a foundation of science that's going to continue very much as we see it now. And everybody often is worried that that won't happen. But the history of numerical weather prediction is a really interesting one in that respect, on which we can model this. Everybody thought when something like ECMWF was founded, that's the end of national weather forecasting efforts, and it wasn't. On the contrary, it's driven them to new great heights, and it has, you know, helped a lot. And I see this very similarly, actually. So I don't suggest we operationalize science. And then I'm also very picky about the services. So this operational production of information is different from the service that then uses that information to communicate with the people who want that information. So we can't just say, here's the information, take it. And that's where the services come in. So I can see in the service world, I can see, again, great public-private partnerships. I can see private services that specialize in certain things that public services are not very good at. And there's public service that provides really great information, but maybe slightly less targeted to a particular individual business, right? So there's a room for both. On the operational modeling, I mean, that's a tricky one. And I don't know the answer who's going to fund it, but I would imagine that with a bit of thought, it could again be a private-public partnership sort of enterprise. But, you know, everybody needs to see the value of it for them to invest in it. And that's the tricky bit, right?
And I'm conscious, so Helen coming back in here, I'm conscious of the time. Lisa and Julie, did you want to, were there more questions lined up, or should we start to wrap up with sort of what happens next?
Well, there are quite a few more questions, but I mean, it says the session will end in 30 seconds, so.
Oh, Vanessa can fix that, can't you?
Yeah.
Yes, she can, yes.
Yeah.
People probably also want to get a cup of tea, so.
Yeah.
So I might actually, we can keep a copy of all these questions. I'm not sure, so the opportunity for people to answer them, I think, themselves, if they wish. Am I right in saying that with this portal? So perhaps we will try and get to answering some of those as best we can. Vanessa, am I able to show my screen? Share my screen? Just in the last.
Share your screen, and as it comes up, I'll add it to the main stage.
Yeah, cool. So it's just coming up now. Okay, I just have to do this trick of, sorry, it's always a bit hard to make it live. No, sorry. My second screen never likes getting the mouse. Oh, we might have to give up. I guess so that the slide that you can see there that's not in presenter format, just in the interest of time, really what I wanted to do at this end is to say, you've heard lots of stuff from us. We really did want, but we didn't do a very good job on the timing, to facilitate more of a conversation. And Sarah made the point that we've got a lot on, we're doing a lot, but we're still quite opaque, the we being WCRP there. So what I'm keen to follow up with, however many people are left on this call, not right now, but after this forum, is there an interest in the Australian community to engage with us, the WCRP, again, to follow up on some of these questions and some of this discussion about these big issues like the future of CMIP? How do we meet the needs of the private sector and public sector for climate information? It's challenging our science. What does that mean? So keen to find out whether her view would be willing to engage with us going forward, so that we can hear from you and be more transparent in terms of what we're doing in the WCRP and get your input and your guidance. And I should say it's not just from the research community, but I know that the Australian government and other agencies have put a lot of thought into research priorities for Australia going forward. We've got the Earth System and Climate Change Hub who are also doing the same thing. So, can we facilitate an ongoing discussion about the nexus between what's important for Australian science, climate science, to meet the needs of Australia, and what the WCRP are doing, so that we can leverage from each other. The Europeans are investing in digital Earth, as Christian has said. What can we here in Australia learn from that? How can we take advantage of what's happening there? So we will follow up with you. If I could have got to my last slide, just to see if the computer wants to talk to me. No, it doesn't want to. I'll make sure, I'm just not sure of the best way to do it, but many of you are already starting to email me, which is fine. So either email me or Julie or Lisa. But if you go to the WCRP web page, you will find your way to a series of places that you can either register your interest, ask a question, go on our list, and we'll we'll make sure that we keep in touch with you. If you don't want us to follow up with you, just let us know after the first email. We're probably going to do a bit of a survey and ask you some questions. If you don't want to be part of that, that's fine. Just let us know, and we'll take note of that. As I said, also we're keen to run some forums that engage with other parts of the region, as well as our early to mid-career researchers. So I'll finish there, thanking you all. Apologies for the poor timekeeping, but there were great questions, and I really thank our speakers and Lisa and Julie for helping moderate. So, thank you.